The autumn chill cut through the air as Serena King stepped off the train in Somerset. The town was quiet, its narrow streets lined with old brick buildings, the kind that hadn't changed much in decades. The heavy coat she wore, along with a wide-brimmed hat, concealed her identity well enough. She wasn't the Serena King that people knew from the governor's office, the powerful, charismatic leader who had become the face of progressive reform. No, today she was simply a black woman alone in a predominantly white town, where her presence would be questioned long before her identity would ever be discovered. Serena walked down the main street with purpose, her heels clicking on the cobblestones, but her mind was miles away. She had heard enough whispers about Somerset. The town had always been resistant to change, a pocket of stubborn defiance, amidst the sweeping reforms she had championed. It wasn't just that the townsfolk resented her policies, it was deeper than that. Somerset was notorious for its hostile treatment of people of color. The stories that had reached her office were enough to make her skin prickle with unease. But she wasn't here to be afraid. She was here to observe, to test if her new laws against racial profiling were making a difference on the ground. This was her state, after all. She had the right to walk any street in any town, as any citizen should. Yet, as she moved through the town square, passing shop windows and quiet cafes, she could feel the weight of eyes on her. Suspicion, curiosity, maybe even contempt. It was subtle, but Serena had grown accustomed to sensing these things, the silent judgment of being black in spaces where blackness was unwelcome. The town was beautiful on the surface, but underneath, there was an undercurrent of tension that buzzed like static in the air. She felt it as she passed the local diner, where a few older white men, hunched over their morning coffee, glanced up, their conversations pausing as they stared. She felt it from the woman walking her dog across the street, who slowed just enough to take a second look at Serena, as if unsure whether she belonged.
Serena's steps didn't falter. She had been through this before. She had dealt with more overt racism in her political career, angry letters, hate-filled speeches, protests outside her office. But here in Somerset it was different. It was quieter. It was woven into the fabric of the place, like the faded signs on the storefronts. No one said anything, but the message was clear enough.
A few more blocks and she would reach the police station. She wanted to pass by, to see if there was any change in the way the officers carried themselves, any sign that the reforms she had enacted were being followed. She had to know if the system was shifting, even in towns like this one. The sound of an approaching police car made her instinctively glance over her shoulder. Her eyes caught the flash of red and blue lights as they reflected off a nearby window. Serena's jaw tightened. Officer Brock Mitchell was cruising down the street, eyes scanning the sidewalks like a hawk looking for prey. He'd worked this beat for over a decade, and he knew every face in this town, every name. Somerset didn't see many outsiders, especially not ones like her. The woman caught his attention the moment she set foot in town. Something about the way she moved, the way her presence disrupted the otherwise serene landscape of Somerset streets, it bothered him. He didn't recognize her, but more importantly, she didn't fit. His gut told him she was trouble. From the moment he saw her, a tight knot of irritation formed in Brock's chest. He slowed the squad car, keeping her in his peripheral vision, his mind already jumping to conclusions. What was she doing here, walking like she owned the place? That long coat and hat didn't fool him. He could spot a liar from a mile away, and something about her reeked of deceit. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he didn't need to. She was a stranger in his town, and that was enough reason to investigate. With a flick of his wrist, Brock turned on his lights, the sharp whirl of the siren cutting through the quiet street. Serena stopped mid-step, turning to face the car with a calm expression that seemed to irritate him even more. She didn't look scared. She didn't look like someone who had anything to hide. But Brock didn't care. He stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement hard, as though he was about to confront a dangerous suspect. "Let me see some ID," Brock barked as he approached, his voice dripping with authority, with entitlement. Serena remained still, her hands at her sides, but there was a steeliness in her posture, in the way she squared her shoulders. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was even, measured, but Brock wasn't in the mood for questions. His jaw clenched as he stopped a few feet from her, towering over her like an enforcer. His eyes scanned her face, searching for something: fear, guilt, submission. But all he found was calm. It infuriated him. Identification, he repeated, this time louder, stepping closer. Serena held his gaze, not flinching, but inside, she could feel the situation escalating. She knew this dance all too well. She could sense the aggression bubbling beneath his skin, the need to exert power. Still, she moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into her coat pocket for her wallet. The moment her hand dipped into her coat, Brock's patience snapped. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he growled, grabbing her arm before she could even pull out her ID. The force of his grip caught Serena off guard, her body stumbling slightly as he yanked her toward him. "I was getting my identification," she managed to say, her voice still calm but now laced with a sharp edge. "Yeah, right. You're not fooling me," Brock hissed, shoving her to the ground without a second thought. "You think you can just walk around here like that? Not in my town?" The fall was rough. Serena hit the pavement hard, her palms scraping against the cold stone as she caught herself. Pain shot up her wrists, but she didn't cry out. She didn't move to get up, not right away. Instead, she lifted her eyes to meet Brock's, her expression one of quiet defiance, even as the humiliation and anger simmered just below the surface.
By now, a few people had gathered. Some were whispering, others filming with their phones. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. But Brock didn't care about the onlookers. His focus was solely on Serena, who remained silent, still sitting on the ground, looking up at him with a calm intensity that only seemed to fuel his rage.
"Get up," he ordered, grabbing her arm again and pulling her roughly to her feet. Serena stood, brushing off her coat as if the dust and dirt were the least of her concerns. Her gaze never wavered, her composure unbroken. "I was only walking," she said softly, but the weight of her words hung heavy between them. Brock's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he held onto her arm. "Not here, you weren't." And just like that, the lines were drawn. The town's bystanders watched in silence, some too afraid to intervene, others too complicit to care. Serena knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been treated this way, every injustice that had gone unished. But she also knew that this officer, this man standing before her, had no idea who he was dealing with, not yet. The sun was barely breaking through the clouds over Somerset as Serena King, draped in a simple coat and hat, stood still in the middle of the street. Officer Brock Mitchell's heavy hand was gripping her wrist, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her skin. The air was thick with tension, and the moment felt as if it could snap under the weight of 1,000 unspoken prejudices. "You don't belong here," Brock snarled, his voice low, but loud enough for the crowd to hear. His eyes, sharp with a mix of disdain and self-assurance, bore into Serena's with an intensity that came from years of unchecked authority. "People like you should stay where you're welcome." Serena's jaw tightened. Not from fear, but from the knowledge that this wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had ever been humiliated, mistreated, or dehumanized by a system that saw them as lesser. Yet she remained silent, her composure a defiant resistance to the hate radiating from Brock. Around them, the town of Somerset was awakening, but not in the way Serena had hoped. A crowd had gathered, their faces a reflection of the divided soul of the country. On one side, a group of older white residents whispered approvingly, their lips curling into satisfied smiles as Brock tightened his grip. "About time someone did something about her kind," one older man muttered, nodding toward his wife, who nodded in agreement. Their gazes were cold, their approval of Brock's actions palpable in the air. On the other side, younger faces, both black and white, looked on with horror, some already holding their phones up, recording the unfolding drama. A young black woman in a hoodie, her eyes wide with disbelief, held her phone steady while muttering to her friend, "This is crazy. He can't do this. Not to her." "That's the governor," someone from the back shouted, their voice trembling with shock and anger. But Brock didn't flinch. The weight of the title meant nothing to him now. All he saw was a black woman he could exert his power over, and that was enough for him to justify his actions. You think you're special because of that title, Brock hissed, yanking Serena toward the squad car. The action was rough, deliberate, meant to humiliate her in front of the onlookers. In this town, you're just another person breaking the law. Serena's silence was deafening. It was the silence of centuries of oppression, of a history that ran through her veins, reminding her that dignity didn't need to shout to be heard. But that didn't stop Brock. He pushed her toward the car, harder this time, and murmurs from the crowd grew louder. "Stop this. You're out of line," yelled a young white man from the other side of the street, his face flushed with anger. "She didn't do anything," added a teenage black boy, his phone still recording. More murmurs followed, some angry, others full of ugly agreement with Brock. "Let him do his job," a middle-aged white woman snapped at the protesters. "If she wasn't doing something wrong, she wouldn't be in cuffs, would she?" This was Somerset, a town where racial divisions had been festering for years under a thin veneer of politeness. Today, that veneer cracked wide open, and the crowd wasn't just watching, it was choosing sides. The video footage being captured from multiple angles showed the scene with stark clarity: a powerful black woman being manhandled by a white police officer, his words filled with venom, the crowd torn between support and outrage. Serena could feel the weight of their stares, some filled with contempt, others with helplessness. As Brock shoved Serena into the back of the squad car, she finally spoke, her voice calm but resonating with a strength that cut through the noise. "This is not just about me." It never was. Her words hung in the air as Brock slammed the door shut, his face twitching with discomfort. The crowd stood frozen for a moment, as if the truth in her words had echoed through the very fabric of the town. Phones were still recording, capturing the moment as if knowing it would soon transcend the quiet streets of Somerset. And indeed, it would. By the time Officer Brock Mitchell had driven Serena King away, the first videos of her arrest had already started to circulate. What began as local whispers of disbelief and shock was rapidly spiraling into something much larger. Within hours, the videos reached platforms far beyond Somerset, and social media erupted in outrage. The footage was hard to watch. In every clip, the contrast between Brock's harsh, authoritative demeanor and Serena's calm composure was unmistakable. The image of a 65-year-old black woman, handcuffed and humiliated, juxtaposed against a younger white officer whose face brimmed with contempt, struck a nerve with the nation. On Twitter, hashtags like Justice for Serena and racial profiling surged to the top of the trending list. The comment sections became battlegrounds of divided opinions, reflecting the deep fissures in American society. "This is disgusting. How can we allow this to happen to a sitting governor?" wrote one user, their anger mirrored by thousands of retweets and likes. Civil rights activists quickly joined the conversation, posting statements of solidarity and calling for immediate action. Others, however, rushed to Brock's defense. "She shouldn't have been there if she wasn't doing anything wrong," one comment read, quickly followed by, "If she's breaking the law, she deserves to be arrested like anyone else." These sentiments were met with fierce rebuttals.
"You mean she deserves to be treated like a criminal because she's black?" responded one user, their tweet quickly gaining traction.
Within hours, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. The arrest of Governor Serena King was no longer just a local incident. It had become a flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about race, power, and the justice system. Networks across the country aired segments of the video, each replay of the footage stoking more fury. Civil rights organizations, already mobilized by the rise of social justice movements, seized the moment. Leaders like Malcolm Rivera of the National Civil Rights Coalition took to social media, calling for Brock Mitchell's immediate suspension and a federal investigation into Somerset's police department. "This is not an isolated incident," Rivera said in a statement. "This is what systemic racism looks like when even a governor can be stripped of her dignity because of the color of her skin. This is why we demand change." Protests began to form outside the Somerset Police Department. What started as a small gathering of local residents swelled as activists from surrounding cities descended on the town, carrying signs that read "No justice, no peace, and stop racial profiling." The noise outside the station grew louder by the minute. Inside the station, Brock Mitchell was beginning to feel the pressure. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from colleagues and superiors, and the station's landlines were ringing off the hook. Civil rights lawyers were calling. Reporters wanted interviews. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and even his fellow officers were starting to distance themselves, the weight of the scandal sinking in. As the day wore on, the narrative around Serena King's arrest continued to grow. Political leaders from across the country, including state senators and congressmen, began issuing statements of support for the governor. What had begun as a moment of public humiliation for Serena was quickly turning into a movement. The storm was just beginning, and its impact would be felt far beyond the borders of Somerset. The tension inside the Somerset police station was palpable. Officer Brock Mitchell, still radiating with self-righteousness, brushed off the commotion outside, dismissing the rising murmurs as just another overreaction by the media and the bleeding hearts, who didn't understand how tough the job was. He had dealt with situations like this before, people crying foul, claiming racial bias, but they never had any real evidence. This time would be no different, he thought. But as Brock sat at his desk, reviewing his paperwork, the station buzzed with a nervous energy. His colleagues, who had initially greeted him with nods of approval when he brought in the trespasser, were now growing uneasy. The phones were ringing off the hook, and the once muted chatter had turned into hurried whispers. The air felt thick with an unspoken question: did Brock just arrest the governor?
He could hear bits of conversation from the officers who walked past him, and for the first time that day, a sliver of doubt began to creep into his mind. He pushed it down. This is a small town, he reasoned. No way someone important would just stroll around here without a security detail. He convinced himself that this was just a misunderstanding, another attempt by people to smear his name and make a political issue out of nothing.
But then Chief Ross entered the room, his expression grim and lined with disbelief. The chief was an old hand in the department, someone who had always had Brock's back, but this time he moved toward Brock's desk with a seriousness that made the hairs on the back of Brock's neck stand up. "Mitchell, we need to talk," Chief Ross said, his voice low but firm.
Brock looked up from his desk, his stomach suddenly knotting. The chief handed him a thin file with shaking hands. Brock frowned, his bravado faltering just slightly, and opened it. There, at the top of the report, staring back at him, was the name Serena King, governor of the state.
For a moment, everything in Brock's world went still. His face drained of color as the realization hit him. He had arrested the governor. And not just any governor, but Serena King, the woman who had been the driving force behind the police reform measures he so deeply resented, the very reforms he had fought against for years.
What? What is this? Brock stammered, disbelief thick in his voice. This can't be right.
But the chief's face was like stone, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pity. "It's her. And you've made one hell of a mess, Brock." Brock felt a rush of panic surging through him, but it quickly turned to anger. His lips curled into a snarl as he slammed the file onto his desk. "This is her fault," he snapped, rising to his feet. "She's been pushing this damn agenda, coddling people like her, making cops like me the bad guys. Of course she'd come here to make a scene." Chief Ross shook his head, looking disgusted. "You didn't even check her ID. You saw a black woman, assumed she didn't belong, and threw her in a cell. Now, because of your stupidity, this whole department is under fire." Brock's fists clenched as he fought to contain his frustration. "The system is broken, Chief. It's protecting people like her, who get to do whatever the hell they want without consequences. She's using her power to make people like me look bad." The chief didn't respond. He simply stared at Brock with an expression that bordered on contempt before walking away, leaving Brock alone with the file in his hands. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, but still, his mind clung to his old excuses. He was doing his job, wasn't he? This was about law and order, not race. But the truth was undeniable now, and it was a truth he wasn't ready to face. Later, when the holding cell was opened and Serena King stepped out, she met Brock's eyes with a calm intensity that chilled him to his core. There was no anger in her expression, just a cold, deliberate resolve. As she walked past him, her voice cut through the room like a blade. "You've spent your life doing this to people who didn't have the power to fight back," she said, her words steady and piercing. "But today you will answer for all of them." Brock stood frozen, the weight of her words settling deep into his chest. There was nothing left to say. The following morning, the nation held its breath. News outlets from every corner of the country descended on the state capitol as Governor Serena King prepared to speak. The video of her arrest had already gone viral, flooding social media with outrage, disbelief, and shock. The image of a black woman being manhandled by a white officer without cause had reignited the flame of a national conversation about race, power, and justice. Serena stood on the steps of the Capitol building, dressed in a crisp, dark suit. Her face, calm but resolute, was illuminated by the morning sun. Behind her stood a coalition of civil rights leaders, local activists, and state officials. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. As she stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell silent, every eye focused on her. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every movement, every word. She took a deep breath, then began to speak. Her voice was steady, but there was a fierceness beneath it that could not be ignored.
"What happened to me in Somerset is not an isolated incident," she said, her voice cutting through the air. "It is a reflection of a system that continues to fail so many of our citizens, particularly those who look like me. Every day, black and brown people are stopped, questioned, detained, and brutalized for no reason other than the color of their skin." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from the crowd, and flashes of cameras lit up the scene.
Serena continued, her voice rising with emotion as she addressed not just her own wrongful arrest, but the broader issues of systemic racism and police brutality. "This isn't just about me," she declared, her voice growing stronger. "This is about a culture of unchecked power, a system that allows officers like Brock Mitchell to act on their biases without consequence. This is about a nation that must confront the ugly truth of racial profiling and the unequal treatment of its citizens." The crowd erupted in applause, but Serena wasn't finished. Her expression hardened as she leaned into the microphone. "I am calling for a federal investigation not just into the Somerset Police Department, but into every law enforcement agency in this state where racial profiling is reported. We cannot allow this to continue. We must hold those in power accountable. We must demand justice not just for me, but for every person who has been unjustly targeted and silenced by this system." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the crowd was silent, absorbing the gravity of what she had just said. Then, the applause began to swell again, louder and more intense than before. People raised their fists in solidarity, and chants for justice echoed through the streets. As Serena stepped back from the podium, she looked out at the sea of faces, some angry, some tearful, but all united. The fire she had sparked was burning brighter than ever, and there was no turning back now. In that moment, Serena King had transformed her personal ordeal into a movement, and the nation was watching, ready to follow her lead. The sun was setting over Somerset, casting long, crimson shadows across the streets that had seen so much of Brock Mitchell's arrogance and unchecked power. For years, he had operated with impunity in this small town, shielded by a culture that tacitly accepted and even encouraged his prejudiced views. But everything was different now. News trucks lined the streets outside the Somerset police station, where crowds gathered holding signs that read "Justice for all, end racial profiling and accountability." Now the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Onlookers and reporters watched as Officer Brock Mitchell, the once untouchable enforcer of a corrupt system, walked out of the station for what would be the last time in uniform. His once proud stride was gone, replaced by a slumped posture, as if the weight of his actions were finally crushing him. Serena King stood among the crowd, not far from where Brock was being escorted by other officers. The contrast between them was striking. Serena, with her head held high, her eyes piercing with purpose; Brock, reduced to a shadow of the man he once thought he was, his gaze downcast, avoiding the cameras and jeers. Brock Mitchell had lost more than his badge. He had become a living symbol of the deep-seated racism that infected not just Somerset, but towns and cities across the nation. And now, that infection was being ripped open for all to see. As Brock was led toward the police car, the crowd erupted into chants, some angry, some celebratory.
No justice, no peace. End racist policing.
Brock's heart raced as the noise surrounded him. He looked around, desperate for some form of support, but all he saw were faces filled with rage and disgust. The very people who once nodded approvingly at him when he patrolled the streets with an iron fist now shouted for his downfall. Even some of the officers who had stood beside him in the force now looked away, embarrassed to be associated with him. Serena stood still, her calm presence radiating amid the chaos. She wasn't angry, at least not in the explosive way many might have expected. Her fight had never been about individual retaliation, it was always bigger than Brock. She saw him for what he was, a symptom of a much larger problem. As the police car door slammed shut behind him, Brock felt the walls closing in. His career, his reputation, everything was gone. He had become the face of everything wrong with law enforcement, and there would be no going back. Days later, the legal machinery that had often protected people like Brock from facing consequences had turned against him. A special investigation was launched into his history of misconduct, and Serena's legal team, alongside civil rights lawyers, were building a strong case against him. In a conference room surrounded by lawyers, Brock sat across from his attorney, his face gaunt, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. "They're going to make an example out of you," his lawyer said bluntly, flipping through a pile of documents. Civil rights violations, excessive force, failure to follow proper procedure. The list goes on. Brock swallowed hard, his throat dry. It was just one mistake, he muttered, still in disbelief. One arrest gone wrong. "I didn't know she was the governor. I didn't." His lawyer cut him off, his voice sharp. "It's not about who she was, Brock. It's about what you did, and what you've been doing for years. There's video footage. Testimonies from people you've mistreated. This isn't going away." Brock looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years on the job, now trembling slightly. He thought about the countless times he had acted on his biases, stopping people simply because they didn't look like they belonged. He never imagined it would come to this. He'd always thought the system would protect him, just like it always had. While Brock's world was crumbling, Serena King's story continued to grow, capturing the nation's attention. She wasn't just the governor who had been wrongfully arrested, she had become a beacon of hope for a growing movement demanding comprehensive reform in law enforcement. At rallies, her voice carried a steady, powerful conviction.
"This isn't just about one bad officer," she said to a crowd of thousands gathered outside the state capitol. "This is about a system that has allowed officers like Brock Mitchell to operate without accountability for far too long. We need change, real change. Not just in Somerset, but across this entire state, across this entire country."
The crowd roared its approval, and as Serena stepped down from the podium, she felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all the people who had been silenced, mistreated, and forgotten. The movement had taken on a life of its own, and she was determined to see it through. Her arrest had sparked protests in cities she'd never even visited, with people from all walks of life demanding justice. Civil rights groups, politicians, and everyday citizens rallied behind her call for police accountability, and the pressure on local governments to reform was growing by the day. Weeks later, Brock found himself alone, walking through a once familiar neighborhood that now felt foreign. Somerset had changed, there were new faces, new voices demanding change. He passed by a mural that had been painted on the side of a building. It depicted Serena King, her face serene and resolute, with the words "Justice for All" emblazoned beneath her. Brock stopped, staring at the mural, feeling a pang of anger mixed with regret. He couldn't shake the image of Serena's eyes, calm and unflinching, when she had been arrested. He thought about the words she had spoken to him in the cell, "How many others have you made like this?" His mind raced back to the faces of those he'd arrested over the years, the people he'd dismissed as troublemakers, the ones he never gave a second thought. Now, their faces haunted him. Suddenly, a group of young activists, recognizing him from the viral videos, approached him. Their eyes were filled with the same intensity he had once seen in Serena's. "You're Brock Mitchell, right?" one of them asked, her voice sharp. The guy who arrested Governor King. Brock felt the heat rise in his face. He was no longer feared. He was the villain now, the one everyone despised. "I'm not that man anymore," Brock whispered, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Doesn't matter who you think you are now," another voice said. "You're the reason we're fighting. You're the reason people like us don't feel safe." Brock didn't respond. He couldn't. There were no words that could erase what he had done. He turned and walked away, the sound of their voices fading behind him, but the weight of their words hung heavy in the air. Months later, Somerset was a town transformed. The police department had undergone sweeping changes, with new leadership committed to transparency and reform. Community oversight boards had been established and mandatory bias training was instituted for all officers. Serena King, though busy with her duties as governor, kept a close eye on Somerset. It had become a model for what was possible when people demanded accountability and justice. She visited the town once more, this time not as an undercover observer, but as a leader embraced by the community. Standing in the town square, Serena addressed the people once again. "This is just the beginning," she said. "The fight for justice is long, and it's not over. But what we've started here in Somerset is proof that change is possible when we come together and demand it." The crowd erupted into applause and Serena smiled, knowing that while the road ahead was still long, the seeds of change had been planted, and they were growing. Brock Mitchell, meanwhile, would never be part of that new beginning. He had become the cautionary tale, the face of what happens when power is wielded unjustly. His downfall was complete, and for him, there was no redemption, only the echoes of a past he could never escape.